The cemetery gate creaked as Caroline Voss, billionaire heiress of Voss Construction, stepped onto the gravel path, her heels sinking slightly into the earth. Behind her, a group of investors chuckled, their voices sharp against the quiet hum of gravestones. But it was the groundskeeper, a dark-skinned man with a weathered face and a broom in hand, who caught her eye, his silence louder than their laughter. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the cemetery, gilding the marble headstones and turning the grass a bruised shade of green. Caroline, in a tailored navy suit that cost more than most people's yearly rent, led her entourage of investors through the rows of graves. They were here to inspect the land she'd acquired for her next project, a gleaming community center, a gift to the city, built on the bones of this forgotten place. Her team of suits, all crisp ties and polished loafers, murmured about profit margins and tax breaks. Caroline's lips curved into a practiced smile, but her mind was elsewhere, calculating timelines, dodging zoning laws, envisioning the headlines. Voss Construction revitalizes city with new landmark. The groundskeeper swept leaves from a nearby plot, his movements slow, deliberate. His clothes were faded, denim jacket, patched jeans, but his posture was unbowed, as if the weight of the world had tried and failed to break him. Caroline barely noticed him at first, her focus on the investors' chatter. But then one of them, a portly man named Richard with a Rolex glinting on his wrist, pointed at the groundskeeper and smirked. "Hey, hope this guy doesn't bury us with the rest of them!" The group erupted in laughter, their voices bouncing off the tombstones. Caroline's laugh was automatic, a reflex honed by years of playing the part, charming, untouchable, always in control. The groundskeeper didn't flinch. His broom kept moving, steady as a metronome, but his eyes flicked up for a moment, meeting Caroline's. They were dark, unreadable, and something in them made her throat tighten. She looked away, adjusting her scarf, suddenly aware of the chill in the air. Just a worker, she told herself, nobody important. But the weight of his gaze lingered, like a pebble in her shoe. "Caroline, you're sure this place is cleared for construction?" Richard asked, still chuckling as he gestured at the groundskeeper. "No ghosts or unsavory types hanging around?" Another round of snickers followed, and Caroline forced a smile, her fingers tightening around the leather strap of her purse. "The permits are in order," she said smoothly, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never been questioned. "This cemetery hasn't been active in decades. The city's already approved the relocation of the graves." She waved a hand, dismissing the rows of weathered stones as if they were mere obstacles. "We're doing the community a favor." The groundskeeper paused, his broom still. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with gray threading through his close-cropped hair. His hands, calloused and scarred, gripped the broom handle like it was an extension of himself. Caroline noticed he wasn't just sweeping, he was sketching, dragging the broom's bristles in deliberate arcs across the dirt. Patterns emerged, faint but intricate, like the outlines of a cityscape. She frowned, stepping closer, her heels crunching on the gravel. "Something wrong, Miss Voss?" Richard asked, following her gaze. "Don't tell me you're spooked by the help." More laughter, sharper this time, cutting through the quiet. Caroline ignored him, her eyes locked on the groundskeeper's work. The dirt patterns weren't random. They looked like buildings, towers, maybe even her buildings, the sleek, modern structures her company was famous for. Her pulse quickened. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. The groundskeeper didn't look up. His accent, when he spoke, was thick, rolling, like stones tumbling in a river. "Cleaning," he said simply, his voice low but clear. "Making things clear." The investors snickered again, but Caroline felt a prickle of unease. She glanced at the dirt again, the lines now smudged by his broom. Just a coincidence, she thought. He's nobody. But the way he'd said, clear, the weight behind it, stuck in her mind like a splinter. Let's move on," she said, turning back to the group. "We've got a schedule to keep." She led them toward the far end of the cemetery, where her team had staked out the boundaries for the new construction. The investors trailed behind, their banter resuming. Stock prices, golf games, the usual. But Caroline's thoughts kept drifting back to the groundskeeper. Why was he sketching in the dirt? Why her buildings? She shook it off, focusing on the pitch she'd prepared. This project was her legacy, proof that she wasn't just her father's daughter, inheriting an empire. She was building one of her own. As the group reached the edge of the cemetery, the groundskeeper's broom stopped. He set it against a tree and sat on a nearby bench, pulling a worn sketchbook from his jacket. Caroline glanced back, catching the motion. He was drawing now, his pencil moving with the same deliberate care he'd used with the broom. She felt a strange urge to walk over, to see what he was creating, but Richard's voice cut through her thoughts. "Carolyn, you're sure about the labor costs on this one?" he asked, flipping through a folder of projections. "Your contracts always come in under budget. What's the secret? Cheap workers?" He winked, and the group laughed again, the sound grating against her nerves. "We optimize," she said curtly, her eyes still on the groundskeeper. "Efficiency is our brand." But the word cheap echoed in her mind, and for the first time, she wondered about the workers who'd built her empire. The faceless crews, the subcontractors, the numbers on a spreadsheet. She'd never questioned how her company kept costs so low. Why would she? Success was in the results, not the details. The sun dipped lower, casting the cemetery in a golden haze. The investors were wrapping up, their cars idling at the gate. Caroline lingered, pretending to check her phone, her eyes drifting back to the groundskeeper. He was still sketching, his head bowed, oblivious to the world. She noticed a small crowd of cemetery visitors, locals maybe, watching him from a distance, whispering. One of them, an older woman with a scarf tied tightly around her head, nodded at him with something like reverence. "Who is he?" Caroline asked, approaching the woman. Her voice was casual, but her curiosity burned. The woman glanced at her, eyes narrowing. "You don't know?" she said, her tone heavy with judgment. "That's Isaiah. Been tending this place for years. Draws what he sees, what he knows." Caroline frowned. "Knows?" The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "You'll see," she said, turning away. Caroline's stomach twisted. She walked toward the bench, her heels clicking against the path. The groundskeeper, Isaiah, didn't look up as she approached. His sketchbook was open, pages filled with intricate drawings. She caught glimpses of faces, buildings, chains. Her breath caught. One sketch showed a boy, no older than 10, his eyes wide and haunted, standing in a field under a looming tower. It looked like one of her company's projects, a housing complex she'd built 2 years ago. "What is this?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. Isaiah finally looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. They weren't angry, not accusing, just steady, like he saw through her. "Truth," he said simply, closing the sketchbook. He stood, tucking it under his arm, and walked away, leaving the bench empty. Caroline stared after him, her heart pounding. She reached for the bench, her fingers brushing something, a single page torn from his sketchbook, left behind. She picked it up, her hands trembling. It was a portrait of her, unmistakable, her sharp cheekbones and steely eyes captured in pencil. Beneath it, in careful, slanted handwriting, "The woman who paid for chains, not knowing who they bound." Her breath hitched. She looked around, but Isaiah was gone, vanished into the lengthening shadows. The investors' cars were pulling away, their laughter fading. Caroline stood alone, the page clutched in her hand, the words burning into her mind. What did he mean? Who was he? And why did her buildings, her legacy, feel suddenly like a weight she couldn't carry? Caroline Voss sat in her corner office, the city skyline sprawling beyond her floor-to-ceiling windows, a glittering testament to her empire. The sketchbook page, creased and worn from her clutching it, lay on her desk beside a half-empty coffee cup, its words taunting her. The woman who paid for chains, not knowing who they bound. The office was silent save for the faint hum of the air. Conditioner. It was past midnight, but sleep was a luxury Caroline hadn't afforded herself since the cemetery. The investors' laughter still echoed in her ears, but it was Isaiah's eyes, steady, knowing, that haunted her. She'd spent the last 3 days digging, her manicured nails tapping furiously at her laptop, pulling up old contracts, subcontractor lists, anything that might explain the sketch, the words, the accusation. Her company, Voss Construction, was a machine of efficiency, built on her father's legacy and her own ruthless ambition. But now, cracks were forming in the foundation. She opened the page again, studying the sketch of her face. The pencil lines were sharp, almost cruel, capturing not just her features but her essence, cold, untouchable, oblivious. Below her portrait, Isaiah had drawn a chain, each link meticulously detailed, wrapping around a building that looked eerily like her Riverfront Towers project. She'd overseen that one herself, a $200 million contract with the state, hailed as a triumph of urban renewal. But the chain, what did it mean? Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. A text from Richard, the investor with the Rolex. "Great job at the cemetery." Board's thrilled. "Let's talk bonuses." Caroline's lip curled. Bonuses, profit margins. The same game she'd played for years, smiling through boardroom deals while her company churned out miracles on a budget. She tossed the phone aside, her eyes drifting back to the sketch. The door to her office swung open, and her assistant, Lena, poked her head in. "Ms. Voss, you're still here? It's late." Lena's voice was soft, but her eyes flicked to the sketchbook page, curiosity flickering. "I'm fine," Caroline said, her tone clipped. "Just reviewing some old files." Lena hesitated, then stepped inside, closing the door. "You've been off since the cemetery. Is it about the groundskeeper? The one who left that?" She nodded at the sketch. Caroline's jaw tightened. She hadn't told anyone about Isaiah's words, but Lena had a knack for noticing what others missed. "It's nothing," she said, folding the page and slipping it into her desk drawer. "Just an overactive imagination." Lena didn't look convinced. "People talk, about him, Isaiah. They say he's been at that cemetery forever. Used to be someone before." "Before what?" Caroline's voice was sharp, betraying her unease. Lena shrugged, her eyes guarded. "Just rumors. Prison maybe, hard times. But he's got a way of seeing things. People listen when he talks." Caroline waved her off. "He's a groundskeeper, Lena. He sweeps dirt." But the words felt hollow, and Lena's silence said she knew it. After Lena left, Caroline pulled up the Riverfront Towers contract on her laptop. Pages of legalese, budgets, subcontractor agreements. She'd signed off on it without a second thought, trusting her team to handle the details. But now, she scanned the names of the subcontractors, obscure firms with generic names like Apex Labor Solutions, Unity Workforce. She Googled them, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The results were sparse. Shell companies, vague websites, no clear ownership. Her stomach churned. She dug deeper, pulling up news articles, public records. A pattern emerged. Whispers of labor violations, lawsuits quietly settled, allegations of unconventional workforce practices. One article, buried in a local paper, mentioned a prison work program tied to Apex Labor. Inmates, paid pennies, building public projects. Caroline's breath caught. Her company had used Apex for Riverfront and others. She leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding. No, she thought, not possible. She'd built schools, hospitals, homes. Her work was good, wasn't it? She wasn't her father, cutting corners, exploiting people. She was different, better. But Isaiah's words clawed at her, not knowing who they bound. The next morning, Caroline drove back to the cemetery. The sky was gray, heavy with the threat of rain. She found Isaiah near the same bench, sketching in his book, his broom propped against a tree. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. She approached, her heels sinking into the soft ground, her usual confidence fraying. "Isaiah," she said, her voice steady but quieter than usual. He didn't look up, his pencil moving in quick, precise strokes. "What did you mean?" "The sketch, the chains." He paused, his eyes flicking to her, then back to his work. "You saw what I drew," he said, his accent thick, deliberate. "You tell me." Her temper flared. "I'm not here for games. You left that page for me. Why?" He closed the sketchbook, standing to face her. He was taller than she'd realized, his presence solid, unyielding. "You build," he said. "Big towers, big dreams. But you don't look down. You don't see the hands that lift your stones." Her throat tightened. "My company follows the law. We don't—" "Law?" He laughed, a low, bitter sound. "Law don't mean justice. You ever ask who's breaking their backs for your profits? Who's locked up working for nothing?" She stepped back, her mind racing. "You're saying my company used prison labor?" He didn't answer, just opened his sketchbook and handed it to her. The pages were a gallery of pain, men and women, young and old, toiling in fields, factories, construction sites. Their faces were vivid, alive with anger, exhaustion, defiance. And there, again, were her buildings, Riverfront Towers, the East Side School, the City Hall Annex. Chains wove through every scene, binding wrists, ankles, lives. Her hands shook as she turned the pages. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Someone who knows," he said, his voice soft but heavy. "Someone who was there." Before she could respond, a car horn blared. Richard and two other investors were pulling up, their sleek SUV glinting in the morning light. "Caroline!" Richard called, stepping out, his grin wide. "Didn't expect to see you slumming it with the help again." Isaiah's face didn't change, but his grip on the sketchbook tightened. Caroline felt a surge of shame, hot and sharp. "I'm busy!" she snapped at Richard, her voice colder than she meant. Richard raised an eyebrow, glancing at Isaiah. "Careful, Ms. Voss. Don't want the locals thinking you're going soft." He laughed, but it was forced, his eyes darting between her and the groundskeeper. Isaiah turned away, picking up his broom, resuming his work. But as Caroline watched, he dragged the bristles in a new pattern, a chain looping around a grave. Her grave, she realized, her name faintly etched in the dirt. She drove back to the city in a daze, the sketchbook's images burned into her mind. That night, she called an old contact, a private investigator named Marcus who'd done discreet work for her father. "I need you to look into my subcontractors," she said, her voice trembling. "Apex Labor, Unity Workforce, all of them. Find out who they're hiring. And why." Marcus's voice crackled through the phone. "You sure?" "Some things are better left buried, Caroline." "No," she said, her eyes on the sketchbook page now pinned to her office wall. "I need the truth." As she hung up, her phone buzzed again. Another text from Richard. "Board's pushing for the cemetery project to start next week. Don't get distracted." She stared at the message, her pulse racing. The system she'd built, the empire she'd nurtured, was closing in, its weight suffocating. But Isaiah's sketches, his words, his quiet defiance, they were a spark, igniting something she couldn't ignore. She wasn't sure what she'd find, but for the first time, she was looking down into the shadows her empire had cast. Caroline Voss stood in the fluorescent-lit boardroom of Voss Construction, her hands steady but her heart hammering against her ribs. The sketchbook page, her portrait, the chains, the damning words, was taped to the wall behind her, a silent accusation looming over the polished mahogany table where her board of directors sat, their faces a mix of confusion and unease. The city skyline glittered through the windows, but Caroline's eyes were fixed on the document spread before her. Marcus, her investigator, had delivered his report that morning, and the truth was uglier than she'd imagined. Apex Labor, Unity Workforce, half a dozen other subcontractors. Her company had been funneling contracts to firms that exploited prison labor, including men and women wrongfully convicted, their sentences extended to keep them working for pennies. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of workers, some as young as 16, toiling on her projects. Riverfront Towers, the East Side School, the City Hall Annex. Her legacy built on their backs. She'd barely slept in days, the weight of Isaiah's sketches pressing on her. Each page had revealed a story. Faces of the forgotten, bound by her contracts, her ignorance. And Isaiah himself, she'd learned, was one of them. A former inmate, wrongfully convicted of theft, sentenced to 5 years of hard labor on a Voss project. His sketches weren't just art, they were testimony. "Caroline, what is this?" Richard, the Rolex-wearing investor, leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You called an emergency meeting to show us drawings?" The others murmured, their eyes darting to the sketch on the wall. She took a breath, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "This isn't about drawings. It's about what we've done. What I've done." She slid Marcus's report across the table, its pages heavy with evidence, court records, payroll ledgers, testimonies from former inmates. "Our company has been profiting off slave labor. Inmates, some innocent, worked to death on our projects. And we looked the other way." The room erupted. Richard slammed a fist on the table. "This is nonsense. Our subcontractors are vetted, legal. You're letting some groundskeeper's scribbles get to you?" "Legal doesn't mean right," Caroline snapped, her voice cutting through the noise. She pointed to the sketch. "That groundskeeper, Isaiah, was one of them. He spent years breaking his back for us, for nothing. And he's not alone." She clicked a remote, and the projector flickered to life, displaying one of Isaiah's sketches. A young boy, eyes hollow, hauling bricks under a tower that bore the Voss logo. Gasps rippled through the room. "This is what we paid for," she said. "This is what I paid for." Her voice broke on the last word, and for the first time in years she felt the sting of tears. She'd built an empire, but at what cost? The boardroom fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Richard's face was red, but he said nothing, his eyes fixed on the sketch. "I trusted you," Caroline continued, her gaze sweeping the room. I trusted our system, but we've been complicit, and it stops now. She'd spent the last week planning, moving pieces in secret. Marcus had connected her with activists, lawyers, former inmates. She'd met them in a community center, ironically, one her company had built, listening to their stories, their pain. One woman, barely older than Caroline, had described working 16-hour days, her hands bleeding, her sentence extended for infractions she never committed. Caroline had seen her face in Isaiah's sketches. "What are you proposing?" a board member asked, her voice cautious. Caroline straightened, her resolve hardening. "I'm stepping down as CEO, effective immediately." The room gasped again, but she pressed on. I'm transferring control of Voss Construction to a coalition of activists and former workers, including those we exploited. They'll oversee a full restructuring. Every contract, every subcontractor will be audited. And I've already contacted the authorities. Our former directors, the ones who buried this, are under investigation. Richard shot to his feet. "You can't do this. You'll tank the company." "Our investors—" "Your investors," Caroline interrupted, her voice like steel, "can choke on their profits. This isn't about money anymore. It's about justice." She turned to the sketch, her portrait staring back at her. The woman who paid for chains. Not anymore. She'd spent hours with Isaiah, listening to his story, his wrongful conviction, his years in chains, his quiet defiance through art. He'd given her the sketchbook, not as a weapon, but as a mirror, and she'd finally looked into it. The next day, Caroline stood outside the cemetery, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. The press was there, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. She'd called them herself, releasing Marcus's report to the public. The headline was already spreading. Billionaire exposes own company's labor scandal, steps down. Isaiah was there too, leaning against a tree, his sketchbook tucked under his arm. He hadn't said much since she'd told him her plan, but his eyes held something new. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "You didn't have to do this," he said, his voice low, steady. "Could have walked away." Caroline shook her head, the weight of the sketchbook page still in her hands, though she'd left it in her office. "I was blind," she said. "You made me see." He nodded, opening his sketchbook to a new page. This one showed her again, but different. No chains, no cold eyes. She stood in a field, the city skyline behind her, but the towers were crumbling, replaced by hands reaching up, free. Below, in his careful script, "The woman who broke the chains." Caroline's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she watched as he sketched, his pencil moving with the same deliberate care she'd first seen in the cemetery. The reporters swarmed closer, but she ignored them, her focus on Isaiah, on the truth he'd shown her. As she walked away, the cameras still flashing, she felt lighter, unburdened. The empire she'd built was crumbling, but something new was rising, something honest, something just. She glanced back at Isaiah, still sketching, his quiet strength a beacon in the chaos. For the first time, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself, something that mattered. The cemetery gate creaked as she passed through, the sound like a promise. She wasn't the woman who paid for chains anymore. She was the woman who'd broken them.